Before Machiavelli gets sharp, before he starts talking, like a man who has seen too many smiling faces hide too many knives, he begins with a kind of sorting. A map of power. Not morality, not dreams, not the golden fog of how rulers imagine themselves in portraits. Just types. Kinds of states, kinds of control, kinds of thrones, and the different roads men take to sit in them. Some principalities are old, inherited, passed down like silverware, land, family grudges, and a last name that already knows how to echo through the halls. Some are new, freshly seized, freshly assembled, held together with nerve, force, luck, and the nervous sweat of a man trying to make tomorrow obey. Some are entirely new. Some are mixed, half old, half new. A strange marriage between what was and what has just been taken. That is where the trouble begins. Because Machiavelli wants the prince to understand something simple and cold. Power is never just power. It has a history, a texture, a mood, a structure. The way you acquire a state changes the kind of burden you inherit. Take something by inheritance, and people are already used to the family name, already trained to live beneath its weather. Take something by conquest, and the walls may still stand, but memory does not kneel so quickly. That is the nerve of the chapter. You do not rule all principalities the same way, because they do not resist the same way. Some lands come to you with habit on your side. Others come with resentment sleeping lightly. Some can be held by continuing the rhythm. Others require disruption, calculation, adaptation. This is Machiavelli, clearing his throat, telling you that politics is not a fairy tale about crowns. It is architecture. Load-bearing walls, cracks in the stone, old loyalties, fresh wounds. The difference between a house you inherit and a house you stole last night while the family inside was still screaming. That is why he starts here. Classification. Because men fail in politics when they confuse different kinds of power for the same animal. But they are not the same. A throne handed down is one creature. A throne snatched from chaos is another. And a wise prince, if such a creature exists, must first learn what exactly he is holding. Not just the title. The condition, not just the crown. The pressure beneath it. This first chapter is the opening move. A cool hand placing pieces on the board, as if Machiavelli is saying, before you speak of virtue, before you speak of fear, before you speak of war, deception, fortune, or love, first know the shape of the thing you want to rule. Because power, like jazz, changes with the structure. And if you do not know what kind of song you have walked into, you will lose the room before the horns even begin.
thrones do not arrive with a knife fight. They arrive with a surname. A father dies, a son steps forward. The banner remains. The coins still carry the same face, or close enough. The people grumble as people always do. But habit is a deep mattress. Most men would rather stay inside what they know than gamble on a new storm. That is the advantage of the hereditary prince. He does not need to invent authority from scratch. He inherits memory. The customs are already worn in. The rituals already rehearsed. The public has already learned how to bow, how to complain, how to endure. This is not love. Machiavelli is too sharp to call it love. It is familiarity, and familiarity is one of power's quietest bodyguards. A new ruler must explain himself. An inherited ruler only has to avoid making a spectacle of his own incompetence. That is the heart of it. To keep a hereditary state, the prince often needs less genius than restraint. Do not overturn everything, do not insult old customs, do not go looking for unnecessary enemies, do not turn the ordinary rhythm of life into a parade of shocks. If the line is ruled for long enough, the people are more likely to forgive weakness than they are to forgive disruption. That is one of Machiavelli's colder insights. Men cling to habit even when habit is not glorious. A mediocre inherited ruler may survive where a brilliant newcomer would be torn apart. Why? Because old power is padded by memory, by the dull comfort of repetition, by the simple fact that yesterday already trained the people to accept today. Of course, there are limits. A hereditary prince can still lose everything if he becomes monstrous, reckless, or absurdly weak. Even old blood can be spilled, but Machiavelli's point is that inheritance gives a ruler a softer landing. He begins with fewer strangers, fewer open wounds, fewer ghosts of conquest staring from the windows. He is not planting himself in hostile soil. He is growing from roots already sunk, and that matters, because politics is not only force, it is rhythm, expectation, routine. The small repeated theater that teaches people what feels normal. The hereditary prince benefits from that theater without even writing the script. He walks onto a stage already built for his name. So this chapter moves with a quieter menace than the others. No dramatic coups, no wild seizures, no storming of gates. just the strange power of continuation. The way a familiar house can keep standing, not because it is beautiful, but because everyone has grown used to the cracks. That is Machiavelli's lesson here. Old rule survives, not because it is always great, but because it is already there. And in politics, already there is often half the victory.
Now the trouble deepens. A mixed principality is not a kingdom born whole. It is an addition, a graft, a fresh piece of land stitched onto an older body. And the body feels it. That is the problem. When a prince takes new territory and adds it to what he already rules, he is not entering empty space. He's stepping into memory, custom, resentment, language, habit. The people may have hated their former ruler. That happens. They may even welcome the conqueror at first, mistaking change for relief. But relief is short-lived. Soon they discover that a new master still feels like a master. Taxes remain, commands remain, disappointment returns, wearing a different coat. That is why mixed principalities are unstable. The old order is gone, but the new one has not yet become natural. So everyone is restless. Those who helped the prince expect reward. Those who lost power dream of revenge. The common people discover that liberation was mostly a slogan painted over another wall. And now the prince must hold something that does not yet feel like his. Machiavelli's advice here is sharp and practical. If the new territory shares language and customs with the old one, the work is easier. Keep the old laws mostly intact. Destroy the old ruling line. Do not shake the ground more than necessary. But if the place is different, if its habits are foreign, its loyalty strange, its instincts not your own, then the danger grows teeth. You may need to live there yourself to see the tremors early, to stamp out rebellion before it learns to sing. Or send colonies, small strategic settlements, less expensive than armies, less hated than constant occupation, and more durable than hired steel. For Machiavelli, this is the cruel arithmetic of rule. A prince who acquires new lands must move quickly, cut deeply when needed, and never trust that first applause. Because people cheer when the old tyrant falls. Then they start measuring the new one. That is the cold lesson of the mixed principality. It is easier to seize than to settle. easier to enter than to belong. And if the prince does not understand the mood of what he has taken, he will lose it while still congratulating himself on the victory. A mixed state is a marriage between conquest and memory. And memory, my friend, is rarely faithful.
Now Machiavelli asks a sly question. Why did some conquered lands rise up the moment the conqueror died while others stayed still, even after the strong hand was gone? Why did Alexander take the kingdom of Darius, then leave behind a structure that did not immediately burst into revolt? Because not all kingdoms are built the same. Some are ruled by one central power, with everyone else serving beneath it like officials, managers, keepers of the machinery. Others are ruled through nobles, lords, old families with their own names, their own followings, their own little islands of loyalty. That difference changes everything. A centralized kingdom is harder to conquer because there are fewer cracks to slip through. You cannot easily bribe independent nobles if there are none with real power to sell. You face one throne, one chain of command, one hard center. But once it falls, once the head is cut off, the body has trouble remembering how to resist. Why? Because the people were trained to obey upward, not sideways, not locally, not through rival houses with ancient pride. The structure was vertical, and when the top collapses, there may be shock, but not always coordination. That is the secret. A kingdom like that is tough to enter, but easier to hold. A kingdom full of nobles is the opposite. Easier to invade, perhaps, because some lord is always nursing a grudge, always ready to betray the king. If it means profit, revenge, or a better seat at the table. But after conquest, now the trouble multiplies, because those same nobles still exist, still known, still rooted, still capable of stirring memory, raising banners, whispering rebellion into the countryside. So Machiavelli is teaching the prince to study structure. Not just strength, not just armies, not just glory, structure. How is obedience arranged? Where does loyalty live? Is power concentrated or scattered through old bloodlines and private pride? That is the jazz underneath the politics, the rhythm below the speech. Alexander could hold what he took from Darius, because the kingdom he conquered was built like a spear. Hard point, single direction, command flowing downward, kill the center, and the rest has no independent music. So this chapter is really about the anatomy of rule. Some states are held together by one spine, others by many bones. And if you do not know which creature you are facing, you may win the war and still misunderstand the body lying before you. That is Machiavelli again. Look past the crown, past the banner, past the shining myth of conquest. Ask instead, what kind of machine is this kingdom? Because the future of victory
depends less on how loudly you enter and more on whether knows how to rebel after you are gone. Here the problem gets sharper. What do you do with a city that used to live free? A city with its own laws, its own customs, its own civic pulse, its own memory of answering to itself. That kind of place is dangerous. Not because it is strong in the obvious sense, because it remembers. And memory is one of the most stubborn forms of rebellion. A people raised under their own laws may bow for a while. They may go quiet. They may calculate, wait, smile through their teeth. But freedom, once tasted, does not rot easily. It lingers in habits, in stories, in the old names. People still whisper when the soldiers pass. That is why Machiavelli is so hard here. He says there are only a few real options. Destroy the city. Go live there yourself. Or let it keep some of its laws, while making sure it stays dependent, watched, and unable to turn memory into force. That first option sounds savage, because it is. But Machiavelli's point is not theatrical cruelty. It is political memory. If a city once governed itself, it will always contain the ghost of that older rhythm. And ghosts in politics do not stay quiet forever. They become slogans, conspiracies, banners, plots in the dark. Men meeting by candlelight, talking about what was lost and how it might return. So the prince must understand what kind of wound he has made. Annexing a free city is not like inheriting a sleepy throne. It is taking hold of something that once had its own pulse. And that pulse may start beating again the moment power looks weak. This chapter is brutal because the diagnosis is brutal. A city used to freedom does not forget freedom. Just because you change the flag, it compares. It remembers the old air. And if you leave it too much room, too much pride, too much structure, it may rebuild itself inside your empire like a hidden second heart. That is the cold lesson. Some conquests fail, not because the army was weak, but because the victor misread memory. Misread the depth of a people's attachment to their own laws. Machiavelli is saying, do not be sentimental about annexation. If you take a free city, you take on its unfinished past. And if you do not master that past, one day that past will come looking for you. Now Machiavelli turns toward his favorite kind of prince. Not the man who inherited a throne like a watch from his father. Not the lucky ornament lifted upward by someone else's sword, but the maker. The self-forged ruler, the one who rises through his own arms, his own nerve, his own ability to bend chaos into shape. This path is hard. Harder to win, harder to climb, harder to survive. In the early days, when everything is raw and the old order still twitches on the floor. Because the new prince must introduce new laws, new structures, new habits. And men do not welcome new orders easily. Those who prospered under the old arrangement will hate him openly. Those who might benefit from the new one will support him only half-heartedly. Because people trust what already exists more than what is merely promised. That is the ache inside reform. The old world has real defenders. The new one has nervous admirers. So the prince who builds by his own strength must be more than bold. He must be durable. Machiavelli reaches back to Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, Theseus. Figures who did not just inherit time, but struck it, shaped it, forced it to accept a new pattern. For him, these men matter, not because they were spotless, but because they had virtue, force of character, adaptability, will, the ability to seize the moment and hold it still, long enough to carve a state from it. This is not virtue in the church sense, not meekness, not innocence, not polished goodness. It is efficacy with fire in its lungs. The prince of this chapter is part sculptor, part wolf, part engineer of obedience. He does not wait for the world to become favorable. He grabs circumstance by the collar. And yes, it is difficult. Machiavelli says, these rulers struggle more when rising. But once they are established, they stand firmer. Why? Because what they built belongs to them in a deeper way, not by paperwork, by authorship. They know where the cracks are. They know what enemies remain. They know which stones they moved with their own hands. That gives them a hard kind of legitimacy, the legitimacy of creation. So this chapter beats like a drum for self-made power, not soft power, not borrowed power, earned power. A principality built by one's own arms is dangerous to gain, but stronger to keep. Because the prince who rises this way is not merely sitting in history, he is writing it. And Machiavelli, for all his coldness, cannot help but admire the man who does not inherit the stage, but builds it while the city watches. Now comes the prince who rises fast, too fast. Not by his own steel, not by his own long discipline, but by favor, by borrowed force, by luck opening a door and waving him through. Fortune smiles. A powerful patron nods. Another army clears the path. A throne appears, almost like a gift. And gifts in politics usually come with fingerprints. This kind of prince has an easier climb, but a shakier seat. Because what comes quickly often roots poorly. He arrives above the crowd before he has built real loyalty, real structure, real command. He has the title, but not yet the weight that keeps the title from blowing away. That is Machiavelli's warning. A man raised by others depends on others, and dependence is a thin floor. If another man's weapons made you prince, then another man's will still lingers in the room. If fortune placed you there, fortune may also grow bored and wander off. That is why these rulers often look strong right before they collapse. They mistake arrival for possession. They think the chair belongs to them because they are sitting in it. But politics is not furniture. You do not own power just because power briefly lets you touch it. Machiavelli gives us Caesar Borgia here, not as a saint, not as a moral example, but as a lesson in terrifying intelligence. Borgia rose through the power of his father, Pope Alexander. Borrowed force, borrowed lift, borrowed weather. But once raised, he understood the danger. He knew he had to cut loose from dependence, to build his own base, his own fear, his own obedience, his own machinery of rule. And so he moved with speed, precision, ruthlessness. He cleared enemies, reshaped territories, tried to turn gift into structure. That is the chapter's pulse. If fortune lifts you, you must hurry to become necessary before fortune changes her mind. Because borrowed power has no soul of its own. It leaves as easily as it arrived. The prince who rises this way must work twice as hard. Once he gets the crown, he must become real. Very quickly, real in the eyes of soldiers, real in the eyes of subjects, real in the architecture of the state. Otherwise, he is not a ruler. He is an event, a brief glitter, a temporary arrangement, a man standing in borrowed sunlight, calling it destiny. Machiavelli respects Borgia because Borgia understood that luck is not enough. The gift is only the beginning. You must still grip the wheel. You must still outlive the hand that helped you. You must still build something that can stand after the patron falls silent. Because in politics, fortune may introduce you, but she will not stay to defend you.
Now the room gets darker, because Machiavelli turns to the prince,
who rises not by inheritance, not by admired ability, not by fortunate sponsorship alone, but by wickedness, by crime, by blood, by calculated brutality. And here is what makes him so unsettling. He does not faint. He does not clutch his chest and run for moral perfume. He studies it coldly, because politics in his world does not stop just because the road to power is filthy. Some men rise by murdering rivals, by eliminating partners, by striking fast enough that terror arrives before resistance can organize itself. This is not glory. Machiavelli does not call it glory. But he does say that even cruelty has a method. There is cruelty used badly, scattered, repeated, sloppy, endless, always reopening the wound, always keeping hatred fresh. And there is cruelty used well, if we can even bear such a phrase, swift, concentrated, deployed at the beginning, then stopped. That is the brutal distinction. If a man seizes power through wickedness, then keeps slicing forever, keeps humiliating, keeps terrorizing, keeps reminding people that they live at the mercy of his appetite. Then he rots his own throne. He teaches the state to hate him daily. But if the violence is sudden, targeted, final enough to clear the field and then gives way to order, then fear may settle into obedience. That is the horror of this chapter. Machiavelli is not blessing evil. He is saying that even evil in politics is judged by structure, by whether it creates lasting order or just endless panic. The ruler who gains power through wickedness must understand one thing. Men can survive one violent storm more easily than a climate of chaos. A single terrible blow may freeze the city. Unending blows teach it to conspire. So the prince of this chapter is not merely cruel, he is surgical. He knows that terror, to be politically useful, must not become a daily hobby. It must establish control, then retreat behind law, routine, the appearance of stability. That is Machiavelli's wicked arithmetic. Do the necessary violence all at once. If you must, then stop, because hatred compounds. And a ruler who keeps reaching for the knife will eventually discover that every room has learned his rhythm. This is not noble teaching. It is morgue-like teaching, hard, pale, unpleasant. But it reveals something central to the prince. For Machiavelli, the question is rarely, was this pure? The question is, what follows from it? Does power harden into order, or decay into permanent fear? That is the divide, and in that divide, the prince who rose by wickedness must decide whether brutality was his ladder or his whole identity. Because if it becomes his whole identity, then the state he's seized by terror will spend its nights dreaming of his end.
Not every prince rides in on horses. Not every ruler takes the city with banners, steel, and the smoke of broken gates. Some rise through the people or through the great, through factions, through class tension, through the crowded old argument between those who want to command and those who only want not to be crushed. This is the civil principality, a prince made inside the city, not born from conquest, but from political weather. Machiavelli sees two humors inside every state. The people who do not want to be oppressed, and the great who want to rule and dominate. Out of that friction, a prince may emerge, lifted by elites who need a figurehead, or raised by the people who want protection from the appetite of the powerful. And here comes the cold distinction. The prince who rises through the people stands on firmer ground. Why? Because the people ask less. They do not all dream of replacing him. They mainly want breathing room, safety, relief from being chewed alive. But the prince, lifted by the great, inherits a nest of appetites. Those men did not help him rise out of pure devotion. They expect payment, influence, access, privilege, a better seat when the music changes. And that is dangerous, because the ambitious are harder to satisfy than the ordinary. The people want not to be harmed. The great want more, always more. So Machiavelli advises the prince to secure the favor of the people, not because he is democratic in the modern sweet sense, because the crowd, if not hated, can be a wall. The nobles, if disappointed, can become daggers. That is the rhythm of the chapter. A ruler made by the people may survive if he protects them. A ruler made by the great must constantly manage the hunger of those who think they helped create him. And creators often become resentful when their creation starts acting like a king. So the civil prince must understand the source of his lift. Who put him there? Why did they do it? What do they expect now? Because in politics, support is rarely simple. It is usually a bargain wearing a smile. This chapter is about urban power, indoor power, corridor power. The kind of ascent that happens not on battlefields, but in chambers, alliances, resentments, and strategic embraces. The prince who rises this way must learn quickly. Better to be anchored by the many than trapped by the few, because the many can keep you standing if they do not hate you. The few may kiss your ring in the morning and redesign your fall by evening. That is Machiavelli's lesson. In a civil principality, the throne is not only a seat, it is a balancing act between appetite and protection. And the wise prince knows which side is asking to live and which side is asking to feed. Now Machiavelli asks a practical question. Not how glorious a state looks, not how polished its ceremonies feel, not how loudly its ruler speaks about destiny, but how strong is it? Really? Can it stand when pressure comes? Can it defend itself with its own bones, its own arms, its own nerve? Or does it survive only because no one serious has tested it yet? That is the measure. A principality is strong when it can hold out, when it can arm its people, fortify itself, endure a siege, make attack expensive, make ambition hesitate. A weak state depends too much on outside rescue, outside fear, outside luck. And luck, as Machiavelli keeps warning, is a woman who does not sign contracts. So the prince must ask himself, if the enemy comes, do I have enough men, enough walls, enough provisions, enough order, enough trust to remain upright? Because strength is not just troops. It is preparation. It is whether the city believes in survival more than surrender. A prince with a fortified town with subjects, not driven into hatred, with enough structure to endure hardship, may survive more than people think. Why? Because long sieges exhaust attackers too. War is expensive, patience leaks, campaigns rot. If the people see that the prince planned ahead, that he did not leave them naked, that he built defenses before the thunder arrived, they are more likely to endure the storm with him. That is important. Machiavelli does not think strength is merely stone. It is also mood, confidence, preparation, the sense that authority has not been sleepwalking. A ruler who lets danger arrive before he starts thinking is already weak. No matter how lovely the capital looks in spring. So this chapter is about reality testing. Strip away the banners, strip away the rhetoric. When the knock comes at the gate, what remains? Can the state stand by itself? Because in politics, imagine strength is one thing, actual endurance is another. And Machiavelli, as always, wants the prince to know the difference before the siege begins. Now Machiavelli steps into strange territory. A principality held not only by arms, not only by blood, not only by habit, but by belief that changes the game. Because ecclesiastical states are not defended like ordinary ones. They carry an invisible armor. They rest on religion, ritual, tradition, and the deep machinery of reverence. A ruler may lose land through weakness, A dynasty may collapse through bad judgment. A new prince may tremble because the ground under his feet is still unsettled. But the churchly ruler stands inside an older spell. His authority is protected by structures that men hesitate to challenge directly. That is why Machiavelli treats these principalities as unusual. They are hard to acquire unless fortune and religious rank have already opened the way. But once acquired, they are easier to hold. Why? Because their roots run deeper than ordinary politics. People obey not just from fear, not just from habit, but from sanctity, from the idea that this order belongs to heaven as much as earth, that is immense power. A prince may need fortresses, troops, cleverness, severity, but an ecclesiastical ruler inherits belief itself as part of the architecture, and belief can hold a throne long after logic would have shaken it loose. This chapter feels different because Machiavelli is almost standing at the edge of his own realism. He knows these states operate by a force larger than ordinary statecraft, not cleaner, not necessarily kinder, just wrapped in a stronger aura. The church in his time was not floating above politics. Like a white cloud, it was in the game, making alliances, shaping wars, crowning power, while also pursuing it. And yet religion gave it a special immunity. A prince could be hated, a dynasty could be overthrown, but sacred authority moves through deeper tunnels. That is the lesson. Some power rules the body, some power rules the imagination, and the second kind is harder to dislodge. So Machiavelli, with that cool Florentine eye, looks at ecclesiastical principalities and sees something almost supernatural in political terms. A state where reverence does half the work, where institutions are fed by centuries, where challenge itself can feel like blasphemy. And that, my friend, is a throne with more than soldiers standing behind it. Now Machiavelli comes for the mercenaries. And he comes hard because nothing disgusts him. Quite like a prince who trusts hired muscle to carry the fate of a state. Mercenaries look useful. That is their charm. They arrive armed, disciplined on the surface, available for pay, ready to wear your colors for the right price. But their loyalty belongs to the coin, not the cause. That is the poison. A mercenary soldier does not fight. Because your city is his home, not because your people are his people, not because defeat would wound his soul he fights, because the contract breathes and contracts, my friend, have no heartbeat. So when the battle turns ugly, when wrist becomes real, when steel starts singing, and the ground gets wet, the hired man begins calculating. Can I survive? Can I switch sides? Can I delay? Can I protect myself better than I protect this prince? That is why Machiavelli calls mercenaries useless and dangerous, useless in battle, because they lack true commitment, dangerous in peace, because ambitious captains may become threats themselves. If they are weak, they fail you. If they are strong, they may rule you. Either way, you sleep badly. This is not just military theory. It is political diagnosis. A prince who depends on mercenaries has already admitted that his state does not stand on its own legs. He has outsourced survival, and survival, once outsourced, stops being yours. That is the cold jazz of this chapter. Machiavelli wants the prince to feel shame at borrowed force, because a ruler who cannot arm his own people or build his own military spine is living on rented courage, and rented courage expires fast. So the lesson here is sharp as broken glass. Do not trust men who fight only for wages to defend what you yourself claim is priceless. A state defended by mercenaries is a house guarded by strangers who might leave at dusk or worse. Decide the house looks better under new management. If mercenaries are bad news, auxiliaries are worse. At least the hired blade pretends to belong to no one but money. The auxiliary soldier belongs to someone else. Another prince, another state, another will standing behind the shield. So when you call in foreign troops to defend your power, you may win the battle and lose your freedom. That is Machiavelli's point. Auxiliaries are dangerous because they are real soldiers, capable soldiers, disciplined soldiers, not weak like mercenaries. And that is exactly why they are more frightening. If they lose, you fall with them. If they win, you may end up in their hands. Either way, your fate is no longer yours. That is no victory. That is dependency wearing armor. A prince who leans on another ruler's army is inviting a guest to sleep inside the walls with his boots on. Maybe the guest helps. Maybe the guest smiles. Maybe the guest saves you from immediate ruin. But the city now knows whose steel really mattered, and steel has a way of becoming authority. Machiavelli would rather a prince lose with his own men than win with another man's army. Because defeat with your own forces can still teach, still harden, still remain yours. But victory through auxiliaries is a kind of polished failure. You survive the day only to weaken the throne. Mixed forces to carry danger. A little of this, a little of that. Mercenaries here, foreign troops there, your own men somewhere in the middle. That is not strength, that is confusion. A state held together by mixed soldiery is a body with borrowed limbs. It may move, but it does not fully belong to itself. And that is what Machiavelli cannot forgive. He wants the prince to have his own arms, his own soldiers, his own people, trained to fight for their own ground. Because only that kind of force has loyalty that can grow roots. The rest is theater. The rest is a ruler trying to purchase security without building it. So this chapter sounds like a warning bell. Do not hand your survival to men whose deepest allegiance lies elsewhere. Because the army that saves you today may quietly become the master. You kneel to tomorrow. Now Machiavelli strips the prince of distractions. No lounging in silk, no drifting through banquets, no mistaking ceremony for strength. A prince, he says, must study war. Not because war is noble, not because blood is holy, but because power without force behind it is a speech waiting to be interrupted. This is the ruler's craft, his discipline, his weather report, his permanent subject. He must think on war in peace, train in peace, prepare in peace, study terrain, weapons, movement, strategy, the habits of danger. Because when war arrives, it is too late to become serious. That is the chapter's pulse. Machiavelli does not want a decorative prince. He wants a wakeful one. A ruler who hunts not merely for sport, but to know the land. A ruler who reads history, not to sound learned, but to study the actions of great captains, their victories, their errors, their timing, their steel of mind. The prince must rehearse conflict before conflict. He must live close to necessity, because men respect what can defend itself, and enemies smell softness early. A ruler ignorant of war is already half defeated. He may inherit a crown, but he cannot keep it. He may enjoy peace, but he does not understand what protects peace. That is Machiavelli's warning. The prince who neglects war becomes dependent on others who did not neglect it. And dependence is the slow poison running through so much of this book. So here the lesson comes down like iron. If you would rule, learn the hard grammar of force. Know the ground, know the enemy, know your own weakness before the enemy does. Because a prince who forgets the art of war will eventually discover that the world has not forgotten it. Now Machiavelli steps into the old theater of reputation. Men praise, men blame, men hang words around a ruler's neck like medals or stones. Generous, cruel, faithful, cowardly, merciful, proud, greedy, bold. The world loves labels. But Machiavelli does not trust them. Because a prince does not live in a clean moral painting. He lives in weather, pressure, threat, survival. And in that world, the traits that earn applause are not always the traits that keep power alive. This is the scandal. Everyone wants the ruler to possess all the polished virtues. Kind, brave, honest, merciful, liberal, upright. A golden man with a crown. But Machiavelli says, plainly, that is lovely in theory and dangerous in practice. Because human affairs do not reward purity with reliable timing. A prince who tries to embody every praised quality may find himself too soft to act, too generous to endure, too trusting to survive. So the ruler must learn a harder art. Not how to be good in every direction, but how to avoid the vices that destroy the state. That is a colder standard. Machiavelli is not saying virtue is worthless. He is saying reputation must answer to necessity. Sometimes what looks harsh preserves order. Sometimes what looks noble opens the gate to ruin. The prince then must stop asking only what will earn praise. He must also ask what will keep the state standing. That question changes the music. Because now morality is no longer a polished mirror. It is a field test. Some faults can be tolerated, some cannot. Some virtues shine beautifully, right up to the moment they become fatal. That is the hard lesson of this chapter. Princes are judged by names, but ruined by consequences. So Machiavelli tells the ruler to care less about appearing flawless and more about staying effective. Because in politics, a prince may be blamed for the very qualities that save him, and praised for the very qualities that bury him. And the grave, my friend, does not care how elegant the compliments were. Now Machiavelli takes up generosity, that glowing virtue people love to praise when someone else is paying for it. A prince wants to be called liberal, open-handed, magnificent. A man of gifts, feasts, coin tossed wide like sunlight. It sounds beautiful. But Machiavelli asks the ugly question: where does the money come from? Because generosity performed too often empties the treasury. And once the treasury thins, the prince must claw it back through taxes, seizures, burdens laid on the people. Now the same ruler who wanted praise for liberality earns hatred for the bill that follows. That is the trap. To seem generous, a prince may spend himself into weakness. And weakness in politics is expensive. So Machiavelli prefers what sounds less charming: meanness, frugality, restraint. Not because it flatters the ear, but because it preserves power. A careful prince can fund war, survive hard seasons, defend the state, and avoid reaching into the pockets of his subjects every time vanity gets hungry. That matters. Because people complain about a ruler who is not lavish, but they hate more deeply the ruler who drains them to keep his image polished. So the wise prince may accept the reputation of stinginess if it keeps him strong, self-sufficient, and less burdensome to the many. There is the cold lesson. Some virtues, when displayed too openly, turn into vices through consequence. Liberality can become ruin. Restraint can become security. Machiavelli does not care much for applause bought on credit. He would rather the prince endure mockery for being tight-fisted than collapse while trying to look glorious. Because a state cannot be fed on compliments. And the prince who spends to be loved may discover too late that affection fades fast, but debt has a long memory. Machiavelli walks into the chamber. Everyone remembers love or fear. It sounds like a clean choice, a philosopher's riddle, a candlelit debate. But Machiavelli is not writing for candlelight. He is writing for rulers, trying to hold power in a dangerous world. A prince would like both, who would not? To be loved and feared, to be admired without being tested. But men are unstable, quick to praise, quick to drift, quick to love you, while it costs them nothing. That is the weakness of love. Love depends on gratitude, on feeling, on the soft weather of human attachment. And soft weather changes. Fear is harder, colder, more reliable. Not terror without limit, not madness, not pointless blood. Machiavelli is careful here. The prince should be feared in such a way that he is not hated. That is the line. Because hatred sharpens knives, hatred creates conspiracies. Hatred teaches men to dream together about your fall. Fear, properly managed, creates obedience. So the wise ruler does not confuse clemency with weakness. Too much mercy may nourish disorder. Too much softness may invite contempt. A prince who cannot punish when punishment is needed may lose more lives through hesitation than through one hard act. That is the brutal lesson. Cruelty, when measured, may preserve order. Clemency, when excessive, may dissolve it. This is why Machiavelli still unsettles. He refuses the sentimental answer. He does not ask what sounds beautiful. He asks what holds, and in that cold arithmetic, fear outlasts love. Why? Because love rests on the hearts of others. Fear rests on your control of consequences. One is voluntary, the other has structure. Still, the prince must not become monstrous. He must not seize property and women carelessly, must not make cruelty a daily perfume. Because once fear turns into hatred, the instrument breaks. So this chapter is not praising savagery, it is praising control. The ruler must know how to inspire enough fear to secure obedience, enough restraint to avoid hatred, and enough judgment to understand that kindness without force is often just an invitation to be swallowed. That is Machiavelli's answer. If you cannot be both, better to be feared than loved. Because in politics, love is a ribbon, fear is a lock. And when the weather turns, it is usually the lock that keeps the door from blowing open. Now Machiavelli turns to promises. Oaths, treaties, declarations made with solemn faces and polished language. The world praises the ruler who keeps faith, the honest prince, the dependable prince, the man whose word travels straight. And yes, that sounds noble. But Machiavelli has watched politics too closely to stop there. Because rulers do not live among saints. They live among schemers, opportunists, liars in formal clothing, men who speak of loyalty while measuring exits. So he asks the harder question. What should a prince do when keeping faith leads to ruin? When the promise no longer serves survival, when others have already broken theirs, when clean honesty becomes a kind of decorated suicide. Here comes the scandal. A prince, he says, must know how to act as both beast and man. Law is the human way, force is the animal way. But because law alone often fails, the ruler must understand the animal grammar too. And here Machiavelli gives us the famous pair, the lion and the fox. The lion frightens wolves, but the lion cannot see traps. The fox sees traps, but the fox cannot frighten wolves. So the prince must be both. That is the lesson. Strength alone is too blunt. Cunning alone is too fragile. Power survives through a mix of force and deceit, majesty and maneuver, teeth and timing. And yes, this stains the moral fabric. Machiavelli knows it. That is why the chapter still hums with danger. He is not saying that falsehood is beautiful. He's saying that politics punishes the ruler who behaves honestly in a world not governed by honesty. That is the cold turn. A prince should appear faithful, upright, merciful, religious, trustworthy. Appearance matters. Men judge more by the eye than by the hand. They see surfaces, they hear phrases. They want to believe in virtue, if virtue wears the right costume. So the ruler must understand theater, not as decoration, but as survival. He may need to break faith when necessity demands it, but he must do so without tearing apart the image that keeps obedience smooth. That is why this chapter bites so hard. It tells us that public morality and political necessity do not always move together. That the prince must sometimes lie well, mask well, perform sincerity, while calculating outcomes. Not because truth is worthless, because vulnerability is expensive. So Machiavelli's prince must keep faith when he can, break faith when he must, and above all understand that in politics a promise is not sacred simply because it was spoken. It is weighed against circumstance, advantage, danger, and the shifting appetite of power. That is not holy teaching. It is survival teaching, hard, unglamorous, sharp in the mouth. And once you hear it, you understand why Machiavelli still feels dangerous. Because he says what polite power tries never to admit. Many rulers keep faith only while faith keeps them safe. Now Machiavelli turns from fear to something more dangerous: hatred. A prince may survive being feared. He may even survive being called harsh, cold, unyielding. But hatred is different. Hatred gathers, hatred whispers, hatred recruits. And beside hatred stands another poison: contempt. To be despised is to look weak, frivolous, unstable, easily manipulated. A ruler more costume than command, that too is fatal. So the prince must avoid both. Do not be hated, do not be despised. That is the line. How? By avoiding the injuries men remembered deepest. Do not seize their property lightly. Do not violate their women. Do not make yourself a daily insult inside their private lives. Men may forgive the death of a father, Machiavelli says, with his usual dark chill, sooner than the loss of inheritance. That is not pretty, it is human. And the prince who ignores that creates enemies with long memories. At the same time, he must not appear soft, indecisive, vain, or ridiculous. A ruler who changes with every gust, who talks grandly, but acts weakly, who cannot punish, cannot decide, cannot hold a line, invites contempt. And contempt opens the gates to conspiracy. Because men plot more easily against a prince. They neither fear nor respect. That is the chapter's pulse. The wise ruler must create a public image of steadiness, seriousness, force of mind. He must seem resolved, not necessarily loved, not necessarily warm, but solid. The kind of man whose edges are not easily tested. If the people as a whole are not hostile and the elites do not smell weakness, then conspiracies struggle to breathe. Why? Because plotters need hope. They need to imagine the public will welcome the fall. If the prince is not widely hated, the conspirator trembles. He does not know whether the dagger will earn applause or horror. So Machiavelli is teaching the politics of atmosphere. Guard your image, guard your boundaries, guard the things that men take personally, and never let the realm settle into the idea that you are either predatory without limit or weak without remedy. Because once a prince becomes hated, the room darkens. Once he becomes despised, the walls thin. And when hatred and contempt begin playing together, the throne starts sounding like loose wood under restless feet. Now Machiavelli looks at fortresses. Walls, stone, gates, moats. The old fantasy that power can make itself safe by piling rock between itself and danger. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. That is his answer. A fortress can help if enemies come from outside, if time must be bought, if the prince needs stone to slow the storm. But a fortress is not magic. If the people hate you, thick walls do not cure that disease. They may even advertise it. A ruler hiding in a fortress can start to look like a man, already afraid of his own city. And fear is contagious. This is the deeper lesson. The best fortress is often not stone, but the absence of hatred. If the people do not despise you, if they do not dream of opening the gates to your enemies, then your position is stronger than any tower can make it. But if they hate you, you can live behind granite and still be doomed. Because walls hold off armies, they do not hold off public appetite for your fall. So Machiavelli is not against fortresses in the childish sense. He is against trusting them too much, against mistaking structure for security, against believing that architecture can replace politics. A prince may destroy weapons in conquered lands, or build strongholds, or use whatever devices seem clever in the moment. But all of these things must be judged by circumstance, not by habit, not by vanity, not because rulers love the look of stone. That is the chapter's pulse. No device saves a prince who misrents the living mood of the state. No wall is strong enough to protect a ruler whose own people would rather see smoke than loyalty. So here, again, Machiavelli brings power back to the same cold center. Do not ask only what looks secure. Ask what actually holds. Because a fortress may guard the body, but only political intelligence guards the throne. And if you must choose between higher walls and fewer enemies, the wiser prince learns first how not to be hated by the city outside the gate. Outside the gate. Now Machiavelli turns to renown. Not mere fame, not gossip, not the cheap sparkle of being talked about. Renown is harder. It is the shaping of public memory, the prince's figure, the prince's force, The prince is a man whose actions ring louder than the echoes around him. A ruler must not drift into obscurity. He must act boldly when needed, publicly when useful, in ways that give the people a clear impression of who he is. Because power, left undefined, gets defined by others. That is dangerous. So Machiavelli advises the prince to undertake great enterprises, to show spirit, resolution, clarity. Not random noise, not vanity projects for applause alone. Actions that create an image of strength and direction. A prince should also know how to declare himself. Not float in ambiguity like a timid host afraid to offend the room. When conflicts arise, he should choose sides with intelligence rather than hide in gray hesitation. Neutrality may look safe, but it often leaves a ruler friendless after the dust clears. Better to be known than to be dismissed as vague weather. And then there is patronage. The prince should honor talent, reward excellence, encourage trade, craft, industry, the motions that make a city feel alive. Not because he is soft, because vitality strengthens rule. A thriving state reflects back on the ruler. Men admire what seems vigorous, ordered, moving somewhere. That is the rhythm of renown. The prince becomes memorable not by hiding, not by speaking prettily, but by creating a pattern others can recognize. Decisive, capable, serious, large enough to leave an imprint. This chapter understands that politics is theater, but not empty theater. Action theater, consequence theater, the management of image through deeds. Machiavelli wants the prince to occupy the imagination. Because once a ruler looks small, hesitant, forgettable, he becomes easier to test. So let the prince act in ways that sharpen his outline. Let him make the state feel directed. Let him reward merit. Let him step into events with enough force that people say, this man is present. This man intends, this man leaves a mark. That is renown, not popularity's shape. And in politics, shape is often the difference between a ruler who is remembered and one who is merely, briefly obeyed. Now Machiavelli turns to the men. Standing near the throne, not the prince himself, but the secretaries, advisors, confidential servants, the quiet figures who carry messages, shape decisions, filter reality, and lean close enough to breathe in the ruler's weather. You can judge a prince by the people around him. That is the lesson. If his ministers are capable, disciplined, loyal, and serious, it says something about the mind that chose them. If they are fools, parasites, ornaments in good fabric, prince too stands exposed. Because bad counsel does not gather by accident. It is invited. A wise prince selects men who think clearly, serve faithfully, and understand that their greatness depends on his stability, not his weakness. That last part matters. The dangerous secretary is the one who serves himself first. The one who uses access as a ladder. The one who treats the ruler's trust like a private bank. Such a man does not advise. He feeds. So the prince must watch for this. Does the minister think of the state or of his own purse? Does he protect the ruler's interests or quietly convert public power into personal advantage? If it is the second, the rot has begun, and the prince must take some blame. Because to choose badly is already weakness. To keep a self-serving advisor is worse. So Machiavelli offers a clean test. Honor loyal ministers, reward them enough that they need not steal, but keep them dependent enough that they remember where their standing comes from. That is the balance. Trust, but structured trust. Respect, without surrender. This chapter is about proximity to power. The ruler may seem solitary, but no prince rules alone. Voices surround him, pens move, reports arrive, interpretations whisper, and so the quality of the prince reveals itself in the company he keeps. A sharp ruler chooses sharp men. A vain ruler chooses flatterers. A weak ruler chooses those who can be used against him later. That is Machiavelli's warning. If you want to know the strength of a prince, do not only watch his speeches. Watch who stands beside him when the doors are closed. Now Machiavelli turns to one of power's oldest diseases, flattery. Sweet poison, soft corruption. The velvet fog that settles around rulers until they stop hearing the real weather outside. Every prince wants truth, at least in theory. But princes also want comfort, admiration, agreement that comes quickly, faces that nod before the sentence is finished. That is how the trap begins. Because once a ruler gets used to praise, honest speech starts sounding rude. Necessary warning starts sounding disloyal. Reality itself begins to feel like bad manners. And then the prince is in danger. Machiavelli knows that men flatter when they want access, safety, influence, profit. They polish the ruler's ego and pick his pockets while he smiles. So the answer is not to let everyone speak freely all the time. That creates disorder. Noise, contempt, no. The prince should choose a few wise men and give them permission to speak truth. When asked, That is the structure. Not open chaos, not sealed vanity. Disciplined honesty. The ruler asks, the wise answer, frankly, without fear. But outside that circle, he keeps his dignity, his authority, his shape that matters. Because a prince who lets every voice pull at his sleeve becomes confused. But a prince who hears only praise becomes blind, and blindness in politics is expensive. So the wise ruler must create a chamber where truth can breathe, then have the strength to hear it. Without rage, without wounded vanity, without punishing the messenger for bringing cold news. That is the real test. Not whether advisors can speak honestly, whether the prince can bear honesty. Because some rulers ask for truth the way drunk men ask for philosophy, only until it hurts. Machiavelli does not want a prince floating inside compliments. He wants a ruler protected from illusion. A man who knows that flattery is not loyalty, that agreement is not wisdom, that praise repeated enough can become a curtain between the throne and the world. So here is the lesson. Choose carefully who may speak plainly. Question them. Listen. Think. But do not become the puppet of every voice. And do not become the captive of your own vanity. Because the prince who cannot escape flatterers is not being served. He is being slowly wrapped in silk until he can no longer move. Now Machiavelli stops theorizing and starts pointing. Look at Italy, he says. Look at the fallen princes. Look at the ruined seats, the lost cities, the broken banners, the thrones turned into furniture for other men. Why did they fall? Not because fate suddenly became unfair. Not because the stars grew hostile overnight. They fell because they were weak in the ways that matter. They leaned on mercenaries. They trusted borrowed arms. They failed to secure the people. They failed to prepare for danger and peace. They mistook appearance for strength. That is the indictment. These princes lost their states, not through mystery, but through negligence. They did not understand the machinery of power, or worse, they understood it too late. Machiavelli has no patience here for decorative excuses. When rulers fall, they often blame fortune, they blame betrayal, they blame the violence of the age. But he pushes back. No. Look deeper. Did they build their own military spine? Did they command loyalty? Did they study war? Did they become hated? Did they grow soft while danger sharpened itself outside the walls? A prince who neglects these questions is already rehearsing his own removal. That is the bitterness of this chapter. Italy, in Machiavelli's eyes, was full of rulers who wanted the appearance of rule without the discipline of it. Men dressed for authority, but unprepared for collision. And when real force came, foreign kings organized invasion, hard steel backed by serious structure. The local princes crumbled. Why? Because vanity is not a defense. Old privilege is not a defense. Hope is not a defense. This chapter feels personal because behind it is Machiavelli's grief for divided Italy, for clever states outplayed by harder men, for rulers too comfortable to face the age honestly. So the lesson cuts clean. If you lose your state, do not rush to blame fortune alone. Ask first what you failed to build, what danger you ignored, what illusion you preferred to preparation. Because princes do not only lose power through bad luck, they lose it through softness, through blindness, through the fatal habit of believing that yesterday's throne will protect them from tomorrow's storm. Now Machiavelli turns to fortune, luck, chance, the wild current, running beneath all human plans. He does not deny it. He is too honest for that. Storms come, circumstances shift. Unexpected men rise, strong cities fall. History leans suddenly and throws half the room against the wall. Yes, fortune is real. But Machiavelli will not kneel to her. He says fortune rules, perhaps half of what happens, half. Not all the rest, he insists, still belongs to human force. Preparation, timing, audacity. That is the fight inside this chapter. Men love to blame fate for what they failed to prepare for. They say, the times changed, the weather turned, the stars were cruel. Maybe. But maybe also, they were rigid when they needed agility, careful when they needed boldness, slow when the hour demanded speed. That is Machiavelli's point. Fortune is like a flood. When the river is calm, wise men build dikes, channels, barriers, ways to guide the violence before it arrives. But fools wait for the waters to rise and then call it destiny. This is not just about luck. It is about responsiveness. Some men succeed because their style matches the times. Then the times change and their old rhythm becomes a trap. The cautious man may thrive in one age and fail in another. The bold man may look reckless until history suddenly starts rewarding nerve. That is why Machiavelli admires audacity. He believes fortune favors the aggressive, the man willing to strike, adapt, improvise, push through uncertainty. instead of standing politely at the edge of the storm. This is one of his most alive chapters. Less cold geometry, more pulse. Because here, power is not only structure, it is rhythm against chaos. The prince cannot control everything, but he can refuse to be passive. He can study the season, he can act before the flood. He can stop treating bad preparation as tragic mystery. That is the lesson. Fortune is strong, yes, but not sovereign. She can batter the world, but she does not own every inch of it. And the prince, who understands this, does not whimper before circumstance. He wrestles it, builds against it, moves with it, challenges it. Because in Machiavelli's world, the worst weakness is not misfortune. It is surrender, disguised as wisdom. And now, after all the coldness, all the diagnosis, all the steel-edged lessons about fear, deception, arms, fortune, and survival, Machiavelli lets the blood rise. Because this final chapter is not only analysis, it is a call. Italy, he sees, is wounded, divided, invaded, handled by foreign powers like a table where strangers keep taking seats. Too many princes failed. Too many states drifted. Too much softness, too much division, too much dependence on men who did not belong to the land. And so the book, after all its hard realism, suddenly leans toward hope. Not soft hope, not dreamy hope, action hope. The cry for a prince. Strong enough, bold enough, awake enough to gather Italy and throw off the barbarians. That word matters. Barbarians. Not because foreign men lacked culture, but because to Machiavelli, they represented humiliation, occupation, the insult of seeing Italy's brilliance left vulnerable to harder powers. This chapter burns differently. Less like instruction, more like trumpet. He wants a redeemer prince, a figure who can do politically what the prophets do in imagination. Unify the broken, summon courage, turn suffering into momentum. And behind it all is grief. Grief for cities divided. Grief for Italy's weakness. Grief for the long spectacle of clever states outplayed by more disciplined force. Machiavelli has spent the whole book teaching the prince how power works. Now he asks, what if someone used that knowledge for rescue? Not rescue through innocence, not rescue through pious wishes, but rescue through strength, arms, timing, and a ruthless refusal to remain fragmented. This final section feels like the mask slipping. The analyst becomes the patriot. The observer becomes the man who wants history to move. He sees the hour, is ripe. Italy, he believes, has suffered enough to be ready. Ready for a banner, ready for a leader, ready for someone who does not merely survive events, but seizes them. And so the book ends, not in resignation, but in summons, a hard book with a burning close, as if Machiavelli is saying, I have shown you the machinery, the traps, the failures, the disciplines of rule. Now rise, not for vanity, not for ornament, not for another pretty court full of polished weakness. Rise for liberation, rise because division has become a wound. Rise because a land of genius should not remain a playground for stronger strangers. That is the strange beauty of the ending. After all the fox wisdom, all the lion wisdom, all the talk of force and necessity, there is still, under the stone, a heartbeat. Italy as possibility. Italy as unfinished music. Italy as a thing worth fighting for. And Machiavelli, for one last page, stopped sounding like a surgeon of power and starts sounding like a man who wants the patient to live.
Mm-hmm.